Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for this very kind introduction. My perspective is more I happen to be at the right point of time, at the right place, and so certain things happened and I had to have more time. I had a bit more time for admin. That's why I'm associated with all these things more than others, but it's not fair. All of this is community effort. But yeah, thanks for the kind introduction. Okay. Yeah, so warm welcome to my talk. A huge thank you to Lucia and Tobias for inviting me. I'm really grateful to be here. A huge thank you to all of you for coming here despite the heat. And I want to start my talk with a very short tribute to Dave. I mean, we've heard a lot, and I agree with everything that all the speakers have said. But there's one thing that hasn't been said, and that's just something I wanted to say. As Lara just mentioned, I have a couple of different backgrounds, so I've peeked into different fields. And I think that we can be extremely lucky to have someone as kind and as open and as supportive as Dave among our leaders. This is very special, and I just wanted to thank you, Dave, for being the person you are. It's the science that makes this great, but it's also your personality and your guidance. And I think, yeah, thank you, Dave. Yeah. And, you know, people in companies behave a bit like their leaders. People in living communities behave a bit like the people who started it, and I can just hope that as a field, we all behave a bit like Dave does when we move into the future in terms of openness for other suggestions and kindness. So yeah, thank you, Dave. Cool. Okay, so my talk today is actually slightly off topic in a certain sense. It's not actually on the book itself, The Conscious Mind, but it's just 1 year earlier. It's on the famous paper, or the development after the paper, Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness. So when the actual theme of the workshop became clear, it got a bit uneasy, but luckily there's this footnote on the first page, and as Dave mentioned himself, he was actually very eager for the book to come out, so maybe implicitly I'm talking about the book too. But the talk itself will be on the hard problem of consciousness, which of course we all love and hate at the same time. Specifically, I will talk about the hard problem of consciousness in light of mathematics, or more specifically mathematical consciousness science. So what's that? So as most of you know, mathematical contributions have been part of the scientific study of consciousness basically from the start. But in the beginning, over the last 25 years or so, they have been rather isolated. You know, there was math here and this theory, some work here. And what we're seeing over the last couple of years is a bit of a more systematic endeavor. There's a community that emerged. There's self-guidance of the community in terms of desiderata, quality goals. And I'm really happy to be part of this, and I just want to emphasize again, my role was just to be there at the right point of time. I had a bit more time for admin. I actually enjoy admin to some extent, so that's why I was part of this, but there are many others who are too. There's Vanya in here. I don't see anyone else right now, but there's really a group of people that are making the association, also the conferences, happen. So we call ourselves mathematical consciousness science, and the idea is that, you know, mathematical consciousness science is to consciousness science the same as mathematical physics is to physics, right? Or mathematical biology is to biology. So there's a rich story that one should actually tell about what the function of these mathematical subfields is. I will skip that. I'll just summarize it as saying that the aim of mathematical consciousness science is to support the field of consciousness science wherever mathematical questions appear or mathematical problems are concerned. Yeah, that's the goal of the field. And what I want to do in this talk is try and think about how these mathematical development could actually support the field where the hard problem is concerned. And as you can imagine, that's a very easy problem, right? So let's give it a go. So the hard problem is something that all of you know about. Here's the abstract, I should say, shell, or the abstract structure of the argument. The idea is, premise 1, we have purely physical explanations, and they explain only the easy problems. Premise 2, explaining consciousness requires more than just explaining the easy problems. Conclusion, no purely physical explanation can explain consciousness. That's the abstract argument. But it's, of course, much more than that. There's a huge body of literature that talks about justifications. Why are the premises true, right? Why does the hard problem matter? We have tons and tons of criticisms. People criticize the premises, or they criticize the relevance. But then even more than that, we have enormous implications for the science of consciousness. You should either do X or you shouldn't do Y, and it depends on how you build your theories or how you shouldn't build your theories. And we have this huge metaphysical debate, which metaphysical conclusions follow from the solvability or insolvability or irrelevance of the hard problem. There has, as I mentioned, there has been tons of literature. There's Dave's original book. There's this collection of papers that answer to Dave's original paper, Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness. Then Dave answers to that, and there's another book, and there's much, much more. There's a huge body of literature, and I think a clear view about the literature alone would require a whole PhD. What is more, the heart problem is really actually become a mindset for those of us who work in the field, a way of thinking, right? We all position ourselves relative to a heart problem. Either we endorse it, or we reject it, or we want to solve it, or we think it's not solvable, or whatever. Like, it's various different opinions, but everyone somehow positions themselves relative to the heart problem. And so in light of this, the task is a little bit hard, I found, to actually think about how mathematics could be of help in any of that debate. And so what I decided to do, in the hope that it will be a little bit useful, at least to some of you, I decided to not only talk about the original formulation of the heart problem, or formulations, but I actually decided to talk about the heart problem in the wild, where in the wild means among working consciousness researchers, and where working consciousness researchers means you can be a philosopher, but also non-philosopher included, right? So I want to kind of maybe first take a little bit of a survey across the various thoughts, the various mindsets that exist. That's going to be the first part of the talk, and then in the second part of the talk, say a little bit about how I think mathematics could help shape or change these intuitions. Okay, so here's first, the whole thing is going to be a sort of a double classification. We'll first classify the types of classes, and then we go through 6 different classes. I hope it's not too boring, but I really think that, me at least, it's helpful for me to think about this. And remember, the goal is that you identify yourself with at most one of the classes, right? If you think that there's going to be 6, if 5 of them are BS, then that's what I intend to do, right? I'll say more about this in a second. Okay, so heart problem. I'm going to take the heart problem as a problem about explanation, as we just had it in the first slide. But I think that's where probably everyone would nod, emphasis on probably, but that's already where the distinctions start. So some people understand the explanation to target the question of why there is something it is like for X to Y, right? Why is there something it's like to be me? I'm going to call this the Y version of the heart problem. Others think about the heart problem in terms of how it is like for X to Y, right? You could say, why is it like this? Or you could also say, the way it is for X to Y. So X is maybe an animal, Y is the animal does something. Then there's also others who think about the heart problems in terms of distribution, right? Distribution of which physical processes are associated with consciousness and which aren't. And so these are sort of the major options. Then for each of them we can think in terms of scientific and metaphysical thoughts. So scientific roughly meaning, well, we can think about the explanation, say, of the why question in the actual world, right? Why is there something it's like to be me in the reality in which we live, which is a question about laws, scientific laws, or maybe regularities. But you can also play the metaphysical game. You can also seek for a metaphysical explanation metaphysically speaking, why there's something like for X to Y. And we can do the same for the how question and the same for the distribution question. And what I'll now do, I'll now run through, so I should say this, so I've kind of made a little bit of a habit. Whenever someone tells me something about the heart problem, I start asking what they mean, right? And I can say to this very day, there was never an instance where 2 people said the same thing, right? So I find this quite sort of interesting and also important maybe to keep track. And so what I'll do now, I'll run now through, I think, 10 or so different conceptions that they're classed in 6 classes, and I hope it's not too dry, but just see where you stand maybe and see where other people can stand. Okay, variants of the heart problem in the wild. The first class I'm going to call functional explanation, because that's also the title of the section Dave's paper, the original paper, and that is, I think, the original conception of the heart problem, and maybe also the most difficult one. And this is a conception of the heart problem that targets the why question, right? Why is there something it is like for X to Y? Why is there conscious experience? So it sits, it's going to come. So it's the following argument from Dave's paper. I modified it slightly. I'll say something about this in a second. Premise 1, physical sciences can only explain function, structure, and dynamics. Premise 2, explaining consciousness is not a matter of explaining function, structure, and dynamics. Therefore, conclusion, it is impossible for the physical sciences to explain consciousness. This is not exactly the original argument. I added dynamics because in the later chapters of Dave's books, he also talks about dynamics. and therefore it's not just structure and function, but also dynamics. So this variant of the hard problem really, or the argument really when you see the argument, it depends on really what you have in mind when you say explaining consciousness. And as I emphasized, in one variant of this functional explanation, the target is really just why there's something it is like for x to y. As Dave said it, why is there something it is like to be me? And if that argument holds true, right, if the premises are true, the logic I think is indisputable, this has extremely strong consequences for consciousness science, as I think I don't have to explain, right? It means that we cannot explain consciousness with any of the things we have in science so far. So that's why it's up here, but it also has a strong bearing on metaphysical views, right? Basically, whenever you hold a metaphysical view according to which such an explanation of consciousness should be possible, then that view is in trouble. Yeah? So this is the first variant of the hard problem. We can do the same variant with the same argument, but with a different explanatory target, namely the question of how it is like for x to y. Yeah? This is, as Dave put it, the question of why it is like this and not like that. And this is what most of us, or many of us, just call phenomenal character, right? So the how variant of the hard problem in the functional explanation form is a question of why is the phenomenal character as it is. But it's not asking about the existence of consciousness, right? So again, if it's true, it has strong implications for science. I don't think it has so many implications for metaphysics, but Keith, please correct me later. So in my view, that's more a scientific problem. Okay. These were the original formulations. Next type of formulation that came up are just very specific notions of explanations that people say. So you might probably have heard them. They're usually in question form. So some people would say the hard problem is how do physical processes give rise to consciousness, to conscious experience? How do biological systems produce consciousness? How can there be conscious experience in a purely physical world? They are, to the best of my knowledge, usually just given based on intuitions, not arguments, and they're actually used in both directions. Some people argue, they put forward a definition of the hard problem like this, but they argue that the hard problem can be solved, e.g. by a particular theory of consciousness, or other people that it is unsolvable with corresponding consequences for consciousness science and also their own activity. So I won't say much about this. People have various different conceptions of consciousness in mind if they say so, but I think it's important to sort of keep track of these specific versions. Next one is the exact opposite. This is just general explanation whatsoever without specification of what the explanatory strategy is. And these are definitions like this, usually just asserted. So some people say the hard problem consists in the impossibility of explaining consciousness, or sometimes the impossibility of explaining consciousness in terms of neural processes or physical mechanisms, or as we all know it and love it, to the explanatory gap itself, which I think can be summarized as the statement that consciousness is incompatible with all notions of explanation at use in science. I think that this implicitly also targets the why question up here, but you could probably make the case that this also works for the how question. The first two are intuitions, the third one is an argument. And I think this class of hard problem understandings is usually used in a negative sense only. So it's, as the statements say, the explanation of consciousness is supposed to be impossible, therefore strong consequences for consciousness science, and again, various different notions of consciousness that are under considerations. Yet another group is using logical relations to make sense of the hard problem. I found that very surprising, but people deep in the field think like that. So they say something like the hard problem is the impossibility of deducing the existence of consciousness from the physical, where deduction is a logical relation, right? Or they might say something about the impossibility of a conceptual identity between consciousness and a physical concept. And on my reading, this is actually more of a metaphysical statement of the hard problem, insofar as metaphysically possible worlds are a subset of the logically possible worlds. But I think that the people who say these variants of the hard problem actually mean them to have scientific implications. They're meant to be something about science. I think that this is probably a misunderstanding of what science does, right? To the best of my knowledge, you cannot legitimately think that science is in the business of deducing stuff from physics. But who knows? Anyway, okay. And the last variant is something we've heard already from Dave. So some people equate the mapping problem with a hard problem, which is basically the question of why conscious experiences are related to the physical as they are. right? And I will only say that I think this is clear what it means, and I will say that this is very close to, or maybe a precursor of what Ender now calls the real problem of consciousness. And so just to quote this on this occasion, he says, it's key to recognize that explaining why consciousness exists at all is not necessary in order to make progress in revealing its material basis, to start building explanatory bridges from the subjective and phenomenal to the objective and measurable. And he furthermore says that if we actually focus on explanation and prediction and control, we will dissolve this sense of mystery that some take the hard problem to be the hard problem about how consciousness relates to matter. Okay, so this was a pretty quick tour. I hope it wasn't too quick about what I think people think, right? Let me know later if you have additions, or you will probably object to at least half of them, ideally 5 of them. So now the second part of the talk. And the second part of the talk is the question what mathematics can actually add to all of this, right? And big warning in ahead, so it's going to be a bit unsystematic, and I guess at least half of the things that I'm saying is known already, if not more, by Dave for sure. Yeah, but still, maybe interesting for some people. Okay, so let's start with functional explanation, but let's actually start with a how variant. Yeah, that's the variant that wanted to explain phenomenal character. So you can say, well, the argument says that explaining consciousness is not a matter of function, structure, and dynamics, right? So when you really focus on phenomenal character, the obvious question from a more formal or structural perspective is, of course, well, wait a minute, phenomenal character can be very successfully described or represented in terms of mathematical structure, right? And we do so a lot in the science of consciousness. Here's just a few examples. So I call these mathematical structures of conscious experience, right? They're known under various different names: quality spaces, qualia spaces, phenomenal spaces, experience spaces, Q spaces, phi structures, Q structures, perceptor spaces, and the list goes on. And what they do is they describe how it is like for X to Y in terms, in part at least, yeah, to some extent, in terms of mathematical structure. That's what they do. So naturally, we can think that, if that works, and it appears to work, then we can actually make these structures the target of explanations, right? So in that sense, the hard problem, if you read it like this, would be something that can actually be solved rather easily. And in fact, several theories of consciousness do so. So higher order theory, to the best of my knowledge, I think these are the 4 we have so far: higher order, integrated information, Jonathan Mason's expected float entropy theory, and the global neuronal workspace theory. So the first 3 do actually explain phenomenal character in terms of structure, and for Gene W can actually just redefine it without adding anything new to also get an explanation of phenomenal character in that sense. I gave a talk in New York at ACC about that, if anyone's interested. Never published it, though, for the obvious reasons. We have theory that do that solve this hard problem, and we also have research programs, and most notably, there's now gigantic qualia structure research program in Japan. That's exactly what he does, right? He does it with very specific, or a bit more specific math in terms of category theory, but it's exactly this. You describe experience in terms of specific structures, and then you somehow put these structures into an explanatory strategy, whatever that may be exactly. That's one research program, but I think also, for example, computational phenomenology as a research program is also doing this, right? Computational phenomenology is this more recent research program that Anil and others are involved in, where you try to build neural models, usually in terms of predictive processing, that target non-ordinary states of consciousness, like, for example, particular meditative states. Yeah, and they do that too. They have math that they use then to represent these states. Can be criticized. I'm not saying it shouldn't be criticized, but they have this math and they target this in explanation. So this version of the hard problem, I think, actually is easy to get, but you can, of course, ask, well, maybe that's just a bit too simple a conception of the hard problem. And that's actually my opinion. Yeah, this is not probably too easy to solve. So let's go a step further. Let's stick with a functional explanation, but now with a Y variant, right? So the idea now is that explaining consciousness we understand the term explaining consciousness as explaining why there is something it is like to be for X to Y at all, right? Explaining the existence of consciousness in a scientific sense. Yeah? And I think most people would agree that this version of the hard problem has much more intuitive force when it comes to the question of whether it has, it looks like, this why question, the existence itself, shouldn't have any function, structure, or dynamics, or at least not, shouldn't. So maybe that problem is hard to solve. And I don't think so. Let me explain why. And to explain why, I wanted to just focus a bit on what that actually is. You know, why there's something is like to be me, why there's something it is like for X to Y. What sort of thing is that? And I love Andrew's recent paper, Andrew Lee, that's actually 2024 already, where he introduces a wonderful, or he repurposes a wonderful metaphor about consciousness, and this is this metaphor of the light in the room. So you probably said this or heard this, that someone says, you know, consciousness means for the lights inside to be on. So what Andrew does in the paper, the reference is going to pop up in a minute, is that he says, so let's focus on that metaphor in more detail, right? So let's think about consciousness in terms of an illuminated room. So here's the room, and there's some light, and there's the room in which the light stands. And so what Andrew does in this paper is that he distinguishes two major conceptions, one of which he calls subjectivity, and one of which he calls phenomenal character. I'm going to use the word consciousness itself. I'm not on board with subjectivity, which is sad. I would love to be on board, but I just can't. But otherwise, the paper is absolutely amazing, right? So, and the distinction is as follows. So this is the goal is to disentangle what we all mean when we just say consciousness like that, for example, in the hard problem context. And so he says subjectivity, or consciousness itself, in the metaphor of the illuminated room, refers to the light itself, right? So in terms of definition, the term subjectivity or consciousness itself refers to what makes an entity feel like something at all, as compared to phenomenal character, which is the room that is then illuminated, not the light source. So phenomenal character is the illuminated room, or as a definition, it is how it feels to be an entity, the way it feels to be an entity. Yeah? So this is just a terminological move to disentangle what we might mean. And what I think is absolutely crucial here in this paper is that A, subjectivity or consciousness itself is meant to be, in that definition, part of phenomenal character. It's not meant to be the consciousness maker in the brain, if something like this exists. It's not meant to be whatever neural property you need to have to be conscious, but it's part of phenomenology, right? It's sort of, in a certain sense, it's that in virtue of which we have phenomenal character at all. So that's the core point. And the second point, I don't think he's very explicit in the paper, is that the whole framework is meant to be open to the possibility that subjectivity or consciousness itself can have structure itself, right? And this is the key move. Now you can ask, okay, Andrew doesn't say, and you can ask, so what's the structure? So let me try to say a little bit about this. And to that structure, I will repurpose two papers I really like. One of the authors is here. I'm sure she's not very happy with what I'm going to say in a second. But anyway, so one of them is one paper by Martine, the paper called Experience Subject and So-Called Mindness, right? And I read this paper as various ways to thinking about what we otherwise colloquially call awareness of awareness, right? So here's a quote of one way of thinking. So in the paper she says, the subject undergoing an experience is thereby aware of undergoing the experience, where this awareness doesn't require any reflection or conceptualization, right? The idea is, at least to my reading, maybe Martina, you might disagree, this is sort of something that all experiences have in common. If you experience, you have that sort of awareness. And the other paper I want to repurpose is a paper by Ken Williford. It's very hard to find. Self-acquaintance and the three regress arguments. Its main its main focus is on like saying something about three types of regresses that have historically been put forward against the idea of awareness. But what he actually discovered in doing so, for the first time ever, to the best of my knowledge, is that you can use a certain type of mathematics, a novel mathematical theory that replaces your ordinary set theory in order to talk about exactly these things. You can use mathematics to literally represent or describe the awareness of awareness that you have in experience. And this mathematical theory is called non-well-founded set theory, also known as hypersets. And needless to say, they're wonderful generalizations to category theory, which are very hard to understand, but the basics here are extremely simple. And so what you can do, for example, you can represent sets in this mathematical language in terms of membership relations. And my pointer doesn't work so well, but the idea is here that I won't explain the whole diagram, that would be a bit too complicated, but the idea is this is a set, and if the arrow goes down, it means that the set down here is a member of the set up here, right? And this is a formal, it's fine, I think. Thank you. And so this is you can formalize that, and it's an entire basis for mathematics. It's as good as what you usually use as well-founded set theory, right? But it's extremely powerful in describing these situations that you otherwise cannot reasonably describe. And so I won't spend too much time here, but this really blew my mind, and I think about this to this day. So he found out that you can use this language. What he didn't find, what we don't know so far is which structure, when you express it in that language, is actually correctly representing or describing awareness of awareness. In fact, we don't even know what correctly means, and this is where my own work comes in. Much of my thinking goes into thinking about the truth conditions of ascriptions of mathematics to conscious experiences. Yeah? But just to say this real quick, so this, the diagram I have here, happy to discuss it later if anyone's interested. I call this the W model because that's what Ken implicitly proposed. But from everything we know, it's just as good as what I call the M model, and I forgot why I called it M model. The idea with the M model is more that conscious experience, so awareness contains itself, whereas the idea of the W model is more that awareness is a relation that relates itself to other stuff in experience. Okay, so this was a bit quick, but the main take-home message I wanted to send here is really just, it is not only possible, but very likely that consciousness itself has a mathematical structure, right? And if that's true, well then, the rest is obvious. Well then we can just make that the target of an explanatory strategy, right? Then explaining why there's something is like to be you is explaining why certain physical processes, if you want, make that structure. Yeah. There's a bit more to say about this. Please feel free to object or ask in the question time. For now, I'm just going to leave it at that. So subjectivity or consciousness itself can be the subject of scientific explanations. Moving on to the next strategy. So this is explanation tout court, yeah? So any assertion of general impossibilities. And then here I really want to focus on the explanatory gap itself, right? You all know the explanatory gap. There's a certain argument behind it and also an intuition. The intuition is that when we've explained everything, we can still wiggle consciousness, so therefore the explanation is likely not good. Yeah. So here I think that, first of all, the structure of consciousness itself that we just discussed may just break these intuitions, right? Maybe explaining consciousness isn't, in a certain sense, different to explaining other stuff that has structure. It's just that we can't use the standard math for it. We have to use a bit better math, right? That's one way mathematical perspectives can change this, but it can also change in the other way. So for example, if we understand the explanatory gap in that general way, any sort of general incompatible with all notions of explanation in science, well then we can go into mathematical representations of conscious experience and we can think about whether we find any such incompatibilities. And I think there's at least one, yeah? And that is, I call this in the paper, I call this non-collatability, which is a terrible translation of the German word Nicht-Abgleichbarkeit, yeah? Which I think is a very nice word. Should have used this. But I'm not saying there definitely is something that's incompatible, but there's something that could be. And this fits perfectly with another paper of Andrews, which I love, a paper called Objective Phenomenology, where he actually shows that talk about the structure of experience is the exact objective phenomenology that Thomas Nagel wanted in his, 78 or 72 or something paper, What is Like to be a Bat. Yeah. So this goes hand in hand. And the difference, where I won't go into details again, but the difference between whether there is non-collatability between experiences or not is an empirical one. We can find out empirically by studying the structure of conscious experience. Okay, cool. Moving on. Next one are these specific explanations. So here I'll just make my life very easy. So these are intuitions, and I think that the intuition that you can't explain how the brain gives rise to conscious experience, or you can't explain why a biological system produces consciousness, and I think here mathematics itself will probably, or should actually change these intuitions, because math is able to explain quite a number of very surprising things in other sciences, like, for example, why one object can be at two places at once in quantum theory, right? So it's not uncommon that, mathematics enables us to actually explain things that, we have intuitions that shouldn't be explainable or something like this. So I think that there will be a general impact, but of course, same story as before, why and how structure of experience will also change these intuitions. What about logical relations? Well, does structure make a difference to in-principle deducibility? Well, I'm not sure, maybe yes, maybe no. It depends a little bit of how exactly you understand the game of logical deduction, right? Like it depends a bit on like what exactly you think about axioms. So there's a maybe there. I don't think it makes a difference to the question of a conceptual identity. But yeah, maybe it makes a little bit of a difference to the deduction. Okay, cool. And finally, mapping problem. Well, I think here, this is a wonderful one. I'll also be a bit brief there. But the mapping problem is great because here, in comparison to the others that I've discussed, the role of mathematics, on my view, is not to sort of provide some foundational help, but it's just like practical implicit help, right? So the mapping problem is there, but in fact, we're already making progress on that end. So for example, C-tests. Just last week, we had a wonderful workshop on C-tests. And so this relates to my work. So there's an alternative to the iterative natural giant strategy that you can just put forward in terms of math. Yeah? Or same for NCCs, search for NCCs. Mathematics can just help us to make a little bit better statistics, right? Or maybe a slightly more general statistics, or ideally statistics that you don't have to subject to the usual binary paradigm. Or the same holds true for computational phenomenology, right? Which Anil himself uses. He isn't here, unfortunately. I think he was supposed to be here. So computational phenomenology also is a way to make use of mathematics to help solve the mapping problem, if you want. Okay, so in conclusion, I wanted to show a few ways in which mathematical consciousness science may impact the hard problem. All of these proposals are initial or need further work, and so the whole talk is really much more of an outlook. And the major upshot for me is really just the absolute endorsement of the possibility of a science of consciousness, which is still, to some extent, in question. A scientific explanation of consciousness is definitely possible, right? And you can use C to denote consciousness or whatever you want. I think explanation of these phenomena is possible. What I also want to emphasize also, though, is that mathematical consciousness science is neutral with respect to the basis of the explanation, right? It is entirely open which science or which metaphysics will eventually deliver a satisfying solution to a satisfying understanding of the hard problem. There's nothing intrinsically either physicalist or anti-physicalist. It's really just another way of looking and contributing. What it does suggest, though, is that maybe we could also try to get a shift away from the discussion of the impossibilities of an explanation, right? And really move more towards the actual constructions of explanations, perhaps in structural terms. Meta-conclusion is, for me, well, you know, we've had 30 years of very successful progress, and I think you've seen this in the other talks. There has been a lot. I think Lucia is on the more critical side of the spectrum. I think we have learned a lot, not only what we don't do, but also what we should do and what we should take into account. But I also think, and we've exploited many disciplines. I think we have the best of philosophers, best psychology, absolutely amazing neuroscience, cognitive science, and many other fields. And the meta pitch of my whole talk is just what we just haven't done over the last 30 years. We just haven't taken the formal disciplines very much into account, you know, and I don't mean their content, I mean their methods. And this is really what we're trying to do with the conference and the association. It is really just trying to fill this gap, not in the sense that this formal perspective is better in any sense or more advanced in any sense. It's really just like, we just haven't done this, so we should get around to do this, and I really think it will close the missing piece. It will be the missing piece to close the gap in the puzzle, so to speak. Cool, okay. So let me thank you for your attention. It was wonderful to be here. I look forward to the question. A huge thank you on this occasion for everyone who's collaborating here in other project, who's helping with Bamberg. And I know many here helped me to set up this initiative in Bamberg where I'm trying to create a little center for people who want to, you know, think about this last piece of the puzzle. Many people are very supportive in that, so a huge thank you, and huge thank you also to everyone else. And if you're interested in these mathematical topics, please consider our conference. It is in Copenhagen this year, main organizer is Camillo Signorelli. Several people here help. Vanya is part of the organization team. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone right now. What we want to do this year is a bit special because we want to experiment with writing a consensus paper at the conference that thinks about the next 30 years, but not in terms of, you know, bets or results, but in terms of integrating the various different new things that are around, from microphenomenology, neurophenomenology, to the more formal approaches. How can we actually get them in one science where we don't talk past each other? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.